All right, kids, today we're going to talk about slavery. And look, I don't even like talking about this topic. I've explained before in my previous videos on the transatlantic slave trade that I have no idea if my ancestors were enslaved. I won't take a DNA test. Turns out I'm 100% assuming that one of my great-greats, some tall, skinny, cold, ice cold drink of water of a man, just heard the last name Wiggins and applied it to himself instead of, thinking that my pupils were held in bondage by someone named Wiggins. I mean, my last name is English, so whatever. You see how creating a narrative, refusing to seek facts, and ignoring information helps me pretend like US Chattel Slavery has no impact on me or America today, right? With that in mind, the other day, I saw this tweet from an account called Declaration of Memes that says 1.6%. Only 1.6% of US citizens owned slaves in 1860, when slavery was at its peak. So you can stop basing your hate for the entire white race for the actions of a mere 1.6%. Now, this stat came from a screenshot of a post by Mark Lutchman. The one of his that I found currently on his Twitter account says an entire race instead of white race. And it asks the question, am I right? It's typical for his tweets to end with, who agrees, or something like that. Lutchman is a self-described former Army National Guardsman, father, and husband. As he adds, don't follow me, follow Jesus Christ. And I'm certain that the homie Mark hasn't tweeted more about Trump and MAGA than Jesus and God, am I right? So while I focus on fact-checking this tweet, all of it, you'll see how these ex-blue checks dance around issues so confidently. But they don't go through the motions, like Jose Moreno here, busting a move during the verses of Lil Baby's That's My Dog. They commit, like Jose Moreno during the chorus. That's his move. Let's start with this 1.6% number. First of all, you may have also seen it presented as 1.4% like it is in this infographic. Second, it may have come from this article from Vice. Either way, neither are true. In 1860, slavery was still legal in 15 of the 33 US states, and slaves represented nearly a third of the population in those slave-holding states. In states like South Carolina and Mississippi, the enslaved made up almost half the population. At the time, the total US population was about 31.4 million, including more than 3.9 million slaves. That left about 27.5 million free people in the US, according to 1860 data from the US Census Bureau. Well, using total population as a reference point also includes babies and children. We don't need USA Today to know that. In the big picture, slaves accounted for 12.6% of the national population, and they couldn't own themselves and each other. But we have to remember that only free people owned slaves, and that the total population of the slave states included enslaved people themselves. So we have to adjust our numbers to reflect only free people. Therefore, 4.75% of the free population of slave states being slave owners, wrote Al Mackey, quoted by Fact Check. What percentage of white Southerners own slaves? Additionally, Adam Rothman, an historian at Georgetown University and an expert in the history of slavery, told Snopes that the percentage of slaveholding families is, quote, the better measure of the extent of slaveholding. One reason this is true, according to historian Adam Goodhart, is that a person could be, and often was, a slave master, but not technically slave owner. Using census numbers for the percentage of families who held slaves, the nationwide calculation is 7.4%. And it's not like all these fact-check websites and articles devoted to disinfo and misinfo who cite historians 100% agree. PolitiFact says 4.9% of people in slaveholding states own slaves, 19.9% of family units in those states own slaves, and that 24.9% of households own slaves. Households are a broader category than families. 1.4%, 1.6%, both have been debunked so many times since August of 2019, yet the stat can still gain millions of views, thousands of likes, 4.5 years later from people who do their own research and have American flags in their bios. And before I continue, I made the mistake of combing through the comment section under both of these 1.6% posts on X, and there's so much support for this nonsense. Then you get sure it was the Democrats types who won't acknowledge that progressives freed the enslaved, plus the black people own slaves too folks who don't accept that freedmen purchase the freedom of family members and also couldn't enslave white people, even if they wanted to. Don't forget about those who want us to agree that white America deserves credit for fighting in and dying in a war to emancipate the enslaved, but also won't take blame for fighting in and dying to maintain the institution of slavery. Or any of this.
I didn't do fucking shit. I didn't fucking do this. I'm not worried about it. I'm not worried about any of this. I'm done. Do what you want.
Like I said, not much pushback. However, there was some. Check out this response. There has never been a time when the super rich were the majority of a population, so I am not sure of what your point is. There were a few plantation/slave owners, more slaves, and even more whites who still benefited from the slave economy. And one of the fact checkers I used a minute ago came from a reply, so there's that. But not one person told Marky Mark that he needs to let slavery go. It was 150 years ago. Move on. Don't let the past hold you back. You weren't even enslaved, which is what I get even when I'm giving y'all New York Times columnist Jamel Bowie, who says that 25% of families owning slaves is not nothing. That's around how much of the current population in the US has a college degree. Ta-Nehisi Coates, writer and columnist who made the distinction between a society with slaves and a slave society. And Robert L. Johnson, a whole black billionaire who made demands for reparations. None of these men seem to be held back by talking about slavery. The point is, among households and family units, the owner/enslaver of the home, usually a man, wasn't the only person who benefited from those being held in bondage. Wives, maybe siblings, perhaps even parents, and especially offspring benefited too, in the form of inheritance. Of course. Add that to the non-rich people who couldn't afford to own humans, but upheld the practice along with the actions of the wealthy in the midst of caping for people who wouldn't let them anywhere near them or their plantations re estates if they ain't got that money. Who's with me?
Perfect.
Speaking of basing your hate for an entire race, and unearned intergenerational wealth, and unpaid labor, and policies that made a certain people with a certain skin color rich and not others. I'll get back to this in a minute, but 40 acres and a mule. Andrew Johnson, President Abraham Lincoln's successor and a sympathizer with the South, who overturned the 40 acres order in the fall of 1865 and, as Barton Myers sadly put it, returned the land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts to the planters who had originally owned it, to the very people who had declared war on the United States of America. So, if you see the subject of this tweet hating any race based on slavery, you're short-sighted.
Instead of 40 acres and a mule, they got the Freedmen's Bank. So instead of land, they were given a bank.
Union soldiers were getting bonuses. So the idea was to create a way to encourage the men to save the money so they wouldn't go squander it or be defrauded out of the money.
It was sold to the freedmen as better than giving you the land. You will earn the money through wages and you will save it and you'll buy your own land and you'll feel better about that. Never mind that hundreds of years of working the land didn't count for earning the land.
By 1872, Freedmen's Bank counted over 70,000 accounts and over $31.2 million, approximately $774 million plus today in deposits, as the bank's trustees began making millions of dollars in loans to their white business partners. Well, after a financial panic in 1873, a year later, depositors could not withdraw their own money. Instead, they were made to wait weeks to retrieve the contents of their accounts. According to the University of Virginia, not even Frederick Douglass, whom the bank's trustees convinced to accept the role as the bank's president in March of 1874, could restore black people's confidence in the bank. On June 29th, 1874, Congress ordered the bank to suspend operations. The more than 61,000 depositors who still held accounts, many of whom poured their lives' savings into this financial institution, lost what remained in the bank. By July 1874, depositors only had collectively $3 million in their accounts. And yes, non-black people were impacted by this as well. You know what? Forget it. The 1790 Naturalization Act, the 1830 Indian Removal Act, the 1862 Homestead Act, the Social Security and Wagner Acts of 1935, redlining, and the first GI Bill. Reconstruction ended in the midst of this, which led to Jim Crow. Can the unnamed you people being addressed in this tweet be mad at the entire race for these things too? What percentage of them brought about these policies? How many prospered because of them? And hey, there were and are policies that benefit black people. When FDR took office in 1933, he promised a new deal for everyone. That included women, black folks, and other groups. While inequities existed under the programs, many women, black folks, and other marginalized groups found employment with the Works Progress Administration. In 1935, the WPA employed approximately 350,000 black Americans, about 15% of its total workforce. When social programs, handouts, and free stuff from the government are delivered to black folks, it's in a rising tide lifts all boats kind of way. And America's economy was delivered on slave ships. Now we gotta take time to get rid of this. Racism was almost dead in America until Obama. I thought when these United States elected Barack Hussein Obama, it entered us into a post-racial society. The first legal slave owner in American history was a black tobacco farmer named Anthony Johnson. No. John Punch, out of Virginia, was the first person sentenced to a lifetime of servitude. He was owned by Hugh Gwynn. Oh, and don't forget, 1860 wasn't when slavery was at its peak. And oh, that's right, we gotta boast about the only people who had power to end slavery did so. Cool. Stuff like that is why bullet points, which clearly come from memes and infographics like these, are sent my way. Even though the picture of these girls are of oyster shuckers from the early 1900s, it's used when trying to prove that the first slaves in America were Irish. No. And what would have ended the Irish enslavement in the US, by the way? Mosquitoes and malaria? Didn't take legislation, a proclamation, or a war? There's no lasting vestiges remaining from that time, no slave blocks or ports of entry. Deflect blame away from European Americans in order to diminish the impact that US chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade has on contemporary America. I'm not as good as a dance teacher as Jose Moreno, and I've never done the steps myself, but I can show you how to move. I really wish my first American ancestor could see me now. I hope I'm his wildest dreams. I bet he was light-skinned though. That would further let me know that he was, never mind. We're gonna be all right. I've done a few of these myth-busting, debunking videos now, and if you like this one, plus the others that you can watch in this playlist, then please let me know. And if you have an idea for more, leave a comment in the comment section. Thank you for watching.
To the left, to the right, to the left.